The king was on his knees, not wounded, not dying, groveling. The most feared Germanic warlord of his generation, a man the Romans had nicknamed Gigas, the giant, a man who had never lost a battle, was prostrating himself on the ground before a 25-year-old who had been a philosophy student in Athens less than 2 years earlier. Contemporary records document what happened before that moment. 13,000 Roman soldiers, exhausted from a 21-mile march in August heat, had faced somewhere between 25,000 and 35,000 of the finest Germanic warriors ever assembled. An army that had already routed a larger Roman force that same season. Then Rome's elite heavy cavalry, its most expensive and prestigious combat arm, broke within minutes of first contact and fled the field. He won anyway. But here is the question historians have never fully resolved. Why did Chnodomar, a king who had defeated every Roman commander sent against him, who held a 3-to-1 numerical advantage, who had an escape boat pre-positioned on the Rhine bank before the battle even began, agree to his own warrior's demand that he dismount and fight on foot? He was a man who had built his entire reputation on never losing. He secretly arranged his own exit before the first sword was drawn. The chronicles document what he did. They never explain why a man who planned to survive chose to make himself blind. You will discover why the Alemanni's most devastating tactical innovation, foot soldiers trained to crawl beneath galloping war horses and drive spears upward into their bellies, worked perfectly at Strasbourg, and why Julian won despite it. You will learn why Julian refused the title of emperor when his own soldiers proclaimed him Augustus in the immediate aftermath of the victory, knowing that being too successful might cost him his life. And you will understand how a single afternoon on the Rhine plain created the conditions for Rome's last pagan emperor, and how the veterans of that battle would, 3 years later, force Julian onto the imperial throne in a Paris winter mutiny. To understand why a man shaped by grief and exile became the commander Rome most needed, and why a giant king who had never lost made the one choice that guaranteed his defeat, we need to go back to the autumn of 350 and the murder that broke the Rhine. In January of the year 350, a Roman soldier named Magnentius murdered the Emperor Constans at a hunting villa in the Pyrenees. The killing took minutes. Its consequences took a decade to begin reversing, and they began on the Rhine. Constans had been the Augustus of the West, the emperor responsible for Gaul, Britain, and Spain. His murder left a power vacuum that Magnentius immediately claimed. The legitimate emperor, Constantius II, ruled the eastern half of the empire and had no intention of accepting his brother's murderer as a colleague. Civil war was inevitable, and it was exactly the kind of Roman civil war the Rhine frontier could not survive, because the frontier's survival depended entirely on the professional field armies that now marched south to fight each other rather than east to guard the river. Contemporary sources suggest that Constantius made a calculation that military historians still debate, that he may have deliberately encouraged the Alemanni and Frankish confederations to raid Magnentius's Gallic territory, using barbarian pressure as a strategic weapon against the usurper. Whether the invitation was explicit or simply the predictable consequence of withdrawing the frontier's defenders, the Germanic tribes needed no second invitation. They had watched Roman soldiers abandon the Rhine for years. They crossed. What followed was not simply raiding. It was occupation. The Alemanni, a confederation of Germanic tribes whose name almost certainly meant all men, had been probing the Rhine frontier since the 3rd century. Now, with the border forces either destroyed or retreating to garrison Gaul's interior cities, they established themselves on the western bank as though the river had always been theirs. City after city fell or was abandoned. Moguntiacum, Mainz, lost its fortifications. Borbetomagus, Worms, was sacked. Nemetai Vangionum, Speyer, watched its garrison destroyed. Argentatum itself, the fortress city that would give this story its name, was seized and used as a base for raids deeper into Gaul. By the time Magnentius died by his own hand in August of 353, ending the civil war, the damage was catalogued in ruins. Ammianus Marcellinus, the soldier historian who would later write the most detailed account of what followed, described the condition of the Rhine frontier with the precision of a man who had walked it personally. Apart from the heavily fortified city of Cologne, only 3 Roman strongpoints remained in Roman hands along hundreds of miles of river. Large Germanic war bands were operating as far west as the River Seine. The Roman border defense forces, the Limitanae, whose entire existence was defined by holding the frontier, had largely dissolved. Those that survived intact had retreated to garrison Gaul's cities rather than hold ground no one could hold. The economic consequences were equally catastrophic. Contemporary accounts estimate that over 20,000 Roman civilians were abducted across the Rhine into agricultural labor in Germanic territory. The implication was not simply humanitarian disaster. It was strategic. Warriors freed from farming could raid. Gaul's fertile agricultural heartland was being systematically bled. Cynics at Constantius's court in Milan whispered openly that the Rhine was finished. What they meant was that fixing it was impossible, that whoever was sent to Gaul was being sent to fail, and that the emperor knew it. The whispers were aimed at Constantius himself, who still needed a representative in the western provinces. He needed someone he could trust. He needed someone he could afford to lose. He needed family. Flavius Claudius Julianus was born in 331 or 32 in Constantinople, the son of Julius Constantius, a half-brother of Constantine the Great. He was 5 years old when his father was murdered. The killings were political surgery. When Constantine died in 337, his 3 surviving sons moved to eliminate rival claimants to the various thrones. Julian's father was among them. Of his immediate family, only Julian and his older half-brother Gallus survived, likely because they were young enough to be considered no threat yet. The 2 survivors were sent to a remote imperial estate in Cappadocia, not quite imprisonment, but nothing resembling freedom. Julian received a Christian education under conditions that Ammianus describes as grinding and supervised, while secretly developing what would become a consuming devotion to pagan philosophy, Greek literature, and the Neoplatonic tradition. He was brilliant, deeply read, and in a position where displaying either his brilliance or his religious heterodoxy too openly might kill him. He learned to conceal both. In 354, his half-brother Gallus was executed by Constantius for mismanagement as Caesar in the East, the same pattern repeating itself. Julian was summoned to Milan. He was 22 years old, the last male member of the Constantinian dynasty still alive, and had every reason to expect that his summons was a prelude to his own execution. What he received instead was a marriage, a title, and an impossible assignment. On November 6th, 355, he was proclaimed Caesar of the West before the army. He accepted with justifiable foreboding, knowing that the honor was double-edged and that Constantius's previous Caesars had all died badly. He was married to Constantius's sister Helena the same day, a political chain dressed as a ceremony. And then he was dispatched to Gaul. Contemporary sources record that Julian arrived at his new command still wearing, in one historian's phrase, his student's gown. His initial military escort to Gaul numbered 360 men, not an army, a retinue. Constantius intended his representative in the west to be a figurehead who would leave the actual governance of Gaul's provinces to the appointed prefects, men who reported to Milan, not to Julian. He was provided with a crippled command and trusted advisors whose loyalty ran east, not to the young Caesar they accompanied. What Constantius did not account for was what kind of man Julian actually was. This was not a court creature shaped by luxury and faction. This was a man raised by grief and enforced isolation, educated in philosophy's hardest questions, trained by his entire life to survive by reading situations more accurately than those around him. He had watched his father murdered, his brother executed, and every male relative of his blood eliminated. He understood power and its mechanisms with the cold clarity of someone who had lived inside them without ever holding any. He spent his first winter in Gaul at Vienne, studying the Alemanni and rebuilding the morale of surviving border garrisons. He was not a soldier. He became one by understanding that he had no alternative. And in the spring of 356, Flavius Claudius Julianus, the man who had arrived in his academic gown, led an army to the Rhine for the first time, beginning the campaign that would end 18 months later, on a plain outside Strasbourg. He was not what Rome had sent. He was what Rome needed. Ammianus Marcellinus, who chose his words with the care of a man who had seen what he described, called Conodomar, quote, one. He then added, as though stating a geological fact, that the king was also very large and strong, even by Germanic standards. The Romans had a nickname for him that required no translation: Gigas, the giant. He was not merely large in the physical sense, though Ammianus makes clear the physical dimension was significant. Conodomar identified himself on battlefields with a gold-leafed parade helmet and a flame-colored plume, visible above the press of men, a king who wanted to be seen. He was large in the political sense that mattered more. The driving force behind the most unified Germanic threat the Rhine frontier had faced in a generation. The Alemanni were not a nation. They were a confederation, their very name almost certainly reflecting this composition, meaning something like, quote, 2 or quote, 3, a joining of tribes from the Rhine's eastern bank into a loose but formidable alliance. The structure ran from paramount kings down through petty kings, noble optimates with their professional warrior retinues, and the general tribal levy of free men obligated to fight. Chnodomar and a co-ruler named Westraup held paramount authority. But Chnodomar was, in every account, the engine. The other kings were participants. He was the architect. His battlefield record before Strasbourg was undefeated. In 352, he had beaten the Roman Caesar Decentius, not a junior officer, but a man commanding imperial forces. In open engagement, his reputation among the Alemanni rested on that victory, and on the decade of successful raiding that followed it. When Constantius sent Barbatio with 25,000 men to drive the Alemanni from Alsace in 357, Chnodomar's forces drove Barbatio's army from the field and forced him to abandon the campaign entirely. He had, within the same season in which he would face Julian, defeated an army nearly twice the size of the force now facing him. His intelligence was excellent, and he knew it. A Roman deserter had provided Chnodomar with Julian's exact strength: 13,000 men. 13,000 against whatever Chnodomar could muster, and what he could muster was considerable, though the exact figure has been debated by historians ever since. Ammianus records 35,000 warriors at Argentatum. Modern historians, examining the logistical and demographic realities of Alemanni society, suggest the figure was likely lower, perhaps 25,000 as a probable midpoint. But even the revisionist estimates agree on the essential ratio. The Alemanni substantially outnumbered the Romans, and Chanadomar had every rational reason to believe the engagement would be brief. One detail in the ancient record complicates the portrait of confidence. Before the battle began, Chanadomar had arranged for a boat to be waiting on the Rhine bank, a private escape route. A king planning a crushing victory against a numerically inferior enemy does not quietly position an exit. The boat was a private acknowledgement, visible only in hindsight, that Chanadomar understood the possibility of failure more clearly than his public certainty suggested. The one non-trivial effort required to raise his army was precisely that, raising it. A full Alemanni levy of this size required Chanadomar to call in every obligation in the Confederation, including obligations that were not freely offered. Two allied kings near Rheitia, Gundamad and Wadamar, had been bound to Rome by Constantius in earlier peace agreements. Chanadomar needed their warriors. Gundamad was killed in an internal coup orchestrated to break his Roman treaty. Wadamar was forced at sword point to abandon his agreement and join the Confederation. This was not a willing alliance gathering in enthusiasm. It was an army assembled under the pressure of a dominant personality, by whatever means were necessary. The captured scouts who reported that the Alemanni army took 3 full days to cross the Rhine bridge suggests the size was genuinely exceptional, whatever the precise number. 3 days of men, horses, and equipment crossing a single bridge is a logistical statement that no document needs to interpret. The army was large, and it was moving toward the one Roman force left in Alsace. On paper, the strategy for the 357 campaign season was sound. The kind of clean geometric thinking that looks persuasive on a military map and depends entirely on the men executing it behaving like the men who planned it. The concept was a pincer. Julian would advance eastward from Reims with his 13,000, pressing the Alemanni from the west. Barbadio, the Magister Peditum, the field marshal of the Roman infantry, would drive north from Augst with 25,000 of Constantius's finest troops, pressing from the south. The Alemanni, caught between 2 Roman forces with the Rhine at their backs, would have nowhere to go. The mathematics of encirclement are unforgiving when they work. This one never got the chance. Barbaccio's conduct during the 357 campaign reads, in Ammianus's account, as a systematic program of sabotage. Whether it was ordered by Constantius, who had already demonstrated his willingness to use indirect means against potential rivals, or whether Barbadio acted from his own jealousy and political calculation, is a question historians still debate. Ammianus, who despised Barbatio, and may have allowed that hatred to color his interpretation, leans toward conspiracy. Modern scholarship, including analyses in the Graduate History Review, argues the withdrawal was more likely the expiration of an operational mandate than deliberate treachery. What is beyond dispute is the effect. When Julian requested the fleet of boats that Barbaccio controlled on the Rhine, boats essential for clearing Alemanni-held islands in the river and closing the northern gap between their forces, Barbaccio refused. Then he burned every boat he had, destroying Roman military equipment to prevent a Roman commander from using it against the enemy. The boats that could have shaped the campaign into the pincer it was designed to be became ash. Events then moved quickly, and all of them in the same direction. A force of Alemanni broke through the gap between the 2 Roman armies and raided as far as Lyon, deep inside Gaul. The kind of penetration that advertised the operation's failure to every province watching. Julian moved cavalry to intercept the raiders on their return east and captured a substantial number. Others escaped, allegedly because Barbatio's men allowed it. The argument between the two commands was becoming something uglier than a disagreement over tactics. Then Barbatio's own army was attacked near Augst by Alemanni forces. His response was to withdraw, not regroup, not hold position, but withdraw the entire 25,000-man force across the Alps into winter quarters in Italy. In the middle of the campaigning season, the Alemanni were not defeated. The objective had not been achieved. Julian had received no notification. Barbatio simply left. This single decision reduced the Roman military presence in Alsace by more than 2/3 and transformed the campaign's strategic situation from a potential encirclement of the Alemanni into something that looked, from Chronodamar's vantage point, like an invitation. Ammianus records what the Alemanni king concluded from Barbatio's retreat, that it confirmed everything he already believed about Roman weakness, and that the remaining Roman force, 13,000 men, isolated, far from support, was now his to destroy at his convenience. Chronodamar gathered the full confederation at Argentatum and sent Julian an ultimatum. The message was brief, as ultimatums usually are. Leave Gaul immediately, or be destroyed. Julian was alone. He read the ultimatum, and he began to think about terrain. The winter of 356 had already taught Julian something important about being abandoned by his own side. He had chosen Sens, southeast of Paris, as his winter quarters that year, distributing most of his troops to other towns to ease the supply burden. A large Alemanni force learned of his reduced escort and besieged him. For 30 days, Julian held Sens with minimal forces, while his magister Equitum Marcellus, the general specifically appointed to support him, stationed close enough to respond, did nothing. Marcellus did not march. He did not send reinforcements. He waited. The Alemanni eventually withdrew on their own, and Julian survived not because of Roman military support, but despite the absence of it. Constantius dismissed Marcellus for what Ammianus called cowardice, and replaced him with a veteran officer named Severus. The lesson lodged. In Gaul, he could count on the soldiers. He could not always count on the generals appointed above or beside him. When Barbatio burned his boats and walked his army home to Italy, Julian processed the betrayal without apparent surprise. He had been here before. What made his decision to fight at Strasbourg rational rather than reckless was a piece of strategic logic that Ammianus records clearly. The Alemanni were, unusually, concentrated into a single mass at Argentatum. Their normal operational pattern was dispersal, raiding in separate bands across a wide front, impossible to decisively defeat because there was never a single target worth engaging. This concentration was a gift. Destroy it here, and the Confederation's capacity for coordinated operations would be shattered for years. Allow it to disperse back across the Rhine, and the same grinding campaign of attrition would resume next season with the Gallic harvest already further depleted. Ammianus also records what was at best an open professional secret among Roman military historians. The late Roman army, when properly organized and led, almost never lost pitched battles against Germanic tribal forces. The barbarians held advantages in numbers, individual physical strength, and shock. The Romans held advantages in formation discipline, equipment quality, and the ability to sustain coordinated action under pressure for longer than tribal armies could maintain their cohesion. The arithmetic of pitched battle favored Julian's professionals. He advanced. After a final march of approximately 21 Roman miles in August heat, roughly 34 kilometers covered in a single day. His troops arrived within sight of the Alemanni position near Argentatum. Julian made the suggestion that any prudent commander would make after such a march. The army should entrench, rest, and fight in the morning. His soldiers refused. Ammianus captures the moment with the wry recognition of someone who understood what it meant. These were veterans. The Palatini regiments who had been fighting successfully all season, who had absorbed ambushes and won skirmishes and watched their general personally rally cavalry and hold sieges with minimal support. They had decided who Julian was. They had also decided that waiting overnight gave the Alemanni time to reconsider, reposition, or disperse. They demanded an immediate battle. Julian yielded. He then did something that was technically a violation of his rank. He delivered a formal address to the entire assembled army, a type of speech reserved by the conventions of the late empire for an Augustus, not a Caesar. He was overstepping his station in the most deliberate possible way. On the eve of a battle he had not chosen to fight today, before soldiers who had just overruled him. Ammianus notes the anomaly without condemning it. The speech was given. The lines were drawn. 21 miles of road stretched behind them, unused. They had all decided collectively not to take it. The upper Rhine plain in August is flat, fertile, and long. Standing in the fields west of Argentatum in 357, looking east toward the river, a man could see considerable distance. Far enough to count flags, to estimate masses of men, to read the shape of an opposing formation before the two armies collided. The terrain appeared neutral. It was not. The battlefield was framed by two features that would determine the engagement's outcome before a single spear was thrown. To the north and east of the Alemanni position, the Rhine itself, not distant, not abstract, but immediate and cold. The river that Chenodomar's army had crossed 3 days earlier and behind which it now stood. Rivers behind an army in open battle are not escape routes. They are obstacles. An army that breaks toward a river in armor is an army that drowns. Every Germanic warrior in Chenodomar's formation had crossed the Rhine to be here. Now it was at their back. The second feature was a dense forest on Chenodomar's right, the Roman left, where the tree line pressed close to the open ground. Dense enough for concealment, isolated enough to serve as the location for Chenodomar's primary opening maneuver. An ambush force under his nephew Serapio, hidden among the trees, waiting for the Roman left to advance within range. It was a sound tactical preparation. The forest would matter, though not in the way Chenodomar intended. Military historians have noted an irony in Chenodomar's deployment that was not apparent to anyone standing in the formation. By positioning his army in the corridor between the forest and the Rhine, he had squeezed his numerical advantage into a linear space. The Alemanni could not envelop the Romans, could not use their superior numbers to outflank and surround. They were constrained into a frontal engagement, exactly the format that Roman formation discipline had been designed to win for centuries. Whether Chenodomar recognized this limitation or was simply positioning instinctively, the terrain had made a choice he had not. Julian drew his infantry in 2 lines. The front line, several ranks deep, would take first contact. The second line, wider spaced, acting as reserve, would be the backstop if the front bent. He placed his best shock infantry, the elite cornuti and bracciati auxilia palatina, on the right of the front line, adjacent to where the cavalry would operate. The Primini Legion held the center of the reserve second line. The entire cavalry force deployed on the Roman right. Julian himself remained mounted, with his 200-man personal escort of picked cavalry, a mobile command group that allowed him to move laterally across the front faster than a man on foot could manage. His gold and purple equipment was visible at the center rear, a deliberate decision. Soldiers needed to see where their commander was. Chnodomar, on the other side of the plain, was also visible, his gold-leafed helmet catching the afternoon sun above the Germanic mass, the flame-colored plume marking the paramount king of the Confederation. Ammianus describes the sound that opened the engagement. The cornuti, the horned ones, named for the Germanic custom of affixing horn-shaped decorations to their helmets, began the Barytus. Tacitus, writing 3 centuries earlier about this same war cry, described it as beginning as a low murmur, soldiers holding their shields before their mouths to amplify resonance, the sound building by degrees into what sounded, in his phrase, like the sea dashing against a cliff. The cornuti's version was reputedly the finest in the late Roman army. On the plain west of Argentatum, it rose from murmur to roar. Across the open ground, the Alemanni heard it and answered. The Barytus was both prediction and weapon. Tacitus recorded that Germanic warriors read its quality as an omen, that a strong Barytus meant confident men who would fight well, and a weak one revealed men who had already begun to doubt. Ammianus, writing his own account of this specific engagement, uses the Barytus as an almost musical transition between pre-battle deployment and the first collision of steel. The sound was how both armies declared who they were before anyone died. The cornuti and bracciati were auxilia palatina, elite auxiliary infantry who had been absorbed into the Roman army's highest grade of field units, bringing their war customs with them. Their Germanic origins were not incidental. They performed the Barytus with authenticity, Ammianus implies, because it was genuinely theirs. The shield resonance technique, the low to high escalation, the collective discipline required to sustain the build from murmur to crescendo. These were not performance. They were culture expressed on a battlefield. Chnodomar's opening gambit came while the Barytus was still building. His nephew Serapio, commanding the ambush force hidden in the woods on the Alemanni right, had been waiting for the Roman left to advance into range of the trees. The strategy was logical. Draw the Roman left-wing infantry toward the forest, then strike them from concealment in flank or rear, while the main Alemanni line fixed their attention from the front. Properly executed, it could collapse the Roman left before Julian's second line had time to respond. Severus, commanding the Roman left, was a veteran officer who had replaced the dismissed Marcellus specifically because he was, in Ammianus's description, a man of demonstrated judgment. He advanced toward the Alemanni center, not toward the trees. He saw the forest. He slowed. He did not commit his men to the tree line, reading the ambush before it was sprung. Serapio's warriors, hidden in the forest's shadow, ran out of patience. The Roman infantry was not obligingly advancing into them. Rather than hold position and wait for conditions to change, the ambush force broke cover and charged. The move transformed a concealed strike into an announced one. The forest advantage instantly negated by the premature disclosure. The Roman infantry on the left, maintaining their fulcrum formation with shields interlocked and angled to deflect rather than absorb impact, received the charge and held. The Alemanni right struck and was repulsed. Serapio's men fell back toward the forest or pressed without breakthrough against the Roman shield wall. The engagement on the left, rather than becoming the catastrophic flank strike Chnodomar had planned, became a localized clash that the Romans controlled. The first of Chnodomar's tactical plans was gone before the main battle had begun. The Roman left remained intact and began to press forward toward the Alemanni center. Severus had read the ground correctly. His caution at the tree line had turned a potential disaster into a tactical non-event. What the repulse of Serapio's ambush also did, less visibly, was strip Constantinople of any ability to threaten the Roman left throughout the rest of the engagement. Serapio's force had committed too early and too transparently. For the remainder of the battle, Julian's left wing would not face serious pressure. The entire weight of the Alemanni effort would have to fall on the Roman center and right. On the Roman right, Chnodemare's most sophisticated preparation was waiting. His cavalry anchored the Alemanni left. But among those horsemen, crouched low and invisible until the moment of contact, waited something the Roman cataphracts had never encountered in quite this form. Chnodemare had trained light-armed infantry to intersperse themselves among his cavalry with a single specific assignment. When the Roman heavy horsemen charged and slowed to engage, these men were to drop to the ground and drive their spears upward into the bellies of the Roman war horses. The cataphracts were forming up on the Roman right. The order to advance came across the plain. The cataphracts were Rome's heaviest military investment on 4 legs. Horse and rider armored in overlapping scales of metal. The horses in lamellar plates across their chests and flanks. The riders in coats of mail that extended down to their thighs. They were not fast cavalry. They were instruments of shock, designed to be the unstoppable mass that broke an enemy line at the moment of full engagement. When their weight and the combined momentum of armored horse became a weapon no infantry formation was supposed to survive. At Argentatum, Ammianus records at least 2 full regiments of cataphracts engaged. The heavy cavalry charged the Alemanni left in the standard Roman fashion, building to full gallop across the open ground, expecting the collision that their entire existence was designed to deliver. Chnodemare's stratagem paid dividends almost immediately, as the cataphracts closed with the Alemanni horsemen and the 2 forces began to merge into the confused close-quarters melee that heavy cavalry engagement becomes. The hidden foot soldiers came up from the ground. They drove their spears into the belly plates of the Roman horses. The one gap in the lamellar protection that armor designed for a standing charge did not adequately cover. Horses screamed. Armored riders found themselves suddenly falling, dismounted into a melee they were not equipped to fight on foot. Weighted down by the same metal that had protected them upright. One of the cavalry tribuni was wounded in the chaos. The sight of their commander hit, the sound of horses dying beneath armored men who could not protect themselves on the ground. The psychological cascade was faster than any tactical order could counter. The cataphracts broke. They turned from the engagement and fled back toward the Roman lines at the speed of panicked horses, which is to say very quickly. In their headlong retreat across the Roman right, they struck their own infantry. The cornuti Ambraciati Auxilia Palatina, posted on the right of the first line precisely where the cavalry crash was now happening, held their formation. Ammianus is specific about this. The auxiliary infantry did not break. They bent around the fleeing cavalry, absorbed the impact, and maintained their shield wall, while the cataphracts passed through and took refuge behind the second line. The cornuti's discipline at this moment prevented what could have been the total collapse of the Roman right. The entire Roman cavalry force had effectively left the field. Julian's right wing was now operating without its mounted element, in a battle against an army that still had its cavalry intact and operational on their left. Julian reacted before the damage could compound. With his 200-man personal escort, he galloped to the right wing, moving through the disordered remnants of his own cavalry to find the fleeing troopers. Ammianus describes what followed with the directness that characterizes his best battle reporting. Julian intercepted the fugitives, shamed them, and compelled them to return to their positions behind the infantry. He did not rage. He did not threaten execution. He made them face what they had done and pointed them back toward the line. The later historian Zosimus, writing more than a century after the battle and considered less reliable than Ammianus on matters of detail, records one specific aftermath detail that has the ring of Julian's documented character. That one regiment of cataphracts refused to return to the engagement even after Julian's personal intervention, and that after the battle's conclusion, they were ordered to parade in women's clothing as punishment for their cowardice. Ammianus does not mention it. The punishment, if it occurred, fits precisely what we know of Julian's philosophy of military discipline. That shame, properly applied, was more corrective than execution. The cataphracts were back behind the infantry lines, humiliated and hesitant. The cavalry crisis had been stabilized, not solved. And across the plain, Chnodomar had watched his most sophisticated tactical gambit succeed completely. He had eliminated Rome's heavy cavalry from the equation. Now he made his second decision of the morning, the one his own warriors demanded of him. The demand was rooted in a fear that Germanic warriors had carried into coalition battles for generations, and it was not an unreasonable fear. When a confederation assembled from multiple tribal groups fought under paramount kings, the question of what the paramount king would do if the battle turned against them was not theoretical. Kings had horses. Infantry did not. A mounted king could be in the rear of his own formation within minutes. His foot soldiers could not follow him. The demand that Chnodomar and the other confederation kings dismount and fight on foot alongside the infantry was an act of coercion dressed as martial honor. The warriors insisting that their commanders have the same exit options they did. Chnodomar agreed. He dismounted. Modern historians examining this decision have noted that it sacrificed the single greatest command advantage a field commander possessed in ancient warfare: elevated perspective and lateral mobility. Julian, remaining mounted with his personal escort, occupied a position that gave him something approaching a map view of the engagement. He could see formations breaking and responding across a front that extended for hundreds of meters, could move to a crisis point faster than any message runner, and could personally intervene when needed, as he had just demonstrated with the cataphracts. Chnodomar, on foot in the press of 30,000 warriors, could see approximately the men immediately around him. Beyond that, he was operating on faith and momentum. What Ammianus also documents is that Chnodomar's warriors' fear was exactly correct. The escape boat was already on the Rhine bank. This is not inference. Ammianus records the boat's existence and the king's attempt to use it. Chnodomar had agreed to fight on foot as an assurance that he would not abandon his men, while simultaneously having arranged the means of abandonment. The contradiction is not cowardice. Exactly. It is the logic of a man who had survived every engagement by planning for multiple outcomes simultaneously. A man who built his confederation's confidence on his own reputation for victory and could not afford to be seen making contingencies. What the escape boat reveals, and this is the script's own analytical reading of Ammianus's documented facts, is that Chnodomar understood the situation more clearly than his public certainty suggested. He knew the Roman army was not what it had been when he had beaten Decentius in 352. The man who had given Barbatio's 25,000 men the excuse to leave Alsace was not the same kind of commander. The decision to fight today, to advance on Argentatum rather than allowing Julian's position to deteriorate through attrition and winter, had been Chnodomar's own. He had chosen this battlefield, this date, this engagement. The boat was his private acknowledgement that he might have chosen wrong. He took his position in the Alemanni mass on foot. The gold-leafed helmet that had marked him above the fighting men was now, by necessity, at the same level as every other warrior's head. His field of view collapsed to the faces of the men around him. The flame-colored plume was still visible to his own men immediately adjacent, to the Roman front line they were about to strike. But Chenodomar could no longer see Julian. He could no longer see his own flanks. He could no longer receive information from the far edges of his line faster than a running man could bring it. He had, at the insistence of men who were afraid he would flee, made himself tactically blind at the moment his army was about to engage the most disciplined professional infantry in the ancient world. Both armies were committed now. On the Roman side, Julian mounted and watching the full engagement from above the infantry press. The Primani legion held in reserve, the Cornuti and Bracciati steady on the right. On the Alemanni side, Chenodomar on foot at the center, his nobles and their professional retinues massing around him. The Confederation's full weight preparing to drive forward and settle the mathematics of 3-1 by sheer momentum. The center of the line came together. The sound of the two armies meeting has no precise description in Ammianus's account, but he had heard it before. The particular compression of noise when two formations of armored men at walking pace enter the killing range of each other's weapons, the crashing plateau that follows as shields locked against shields and the front ranks attempted to kill the men 6 inches in front of them. He describes the engagement in clinical terms that carry their own violence. The Roman fulcrum received the Alemanni mass, and neither moved. The fulcrum was not a complex tactic. It required no genius to design. What it required was men of extraordinary discipline to execute, because the fulcrum's entire strategic logic depended on the ability to absorb shock without breaking formation. To convert the kinetic energy of thousands of men driving forward at full weight into a contest of sustained pressure rather than momentum. The front-rank legionary in the fulcrum stood with his shield angled at approximately 45 degrees, transferring incoming force downward and to the side rather than absorbing it full face. Behind him, the men in the second rank pressed their shields against the back of the first rank's shield, adding their weight to stabilize the wall. The third rank did the same. It was geometry, not bravery, though bravery was required to hold the geometry when the pressure exceeded what muscles and bone could comfortably sustain. Against this formation, the Alemanni's preferred offensive tactic was the globus, a mass wedge, thickened at the point and spreading backward, designed to punch through enemy formation and the way a fist punches through a wall. The globus concentrated momentum at its tip, where the Confederation's finest warriors and the professional noble retinues fought alongside Chenodomar's own guard. It was effective against Gallic or irregular forces that broke under the initial shock. Against Roman disciplined infantry in fulcrum formation, it became a test of endurance. Ammianus records the combat in terms that make clear the engagement was not brief. The two lines pressed against each other along the front in what ancient sources routinely describe as an othismos, a literal pushing contest, shields against shields, men using their entire bodies as levers to drive the opposing formation backward. On the Roman side, the advantage was organizational. The two-line formation meant that tired front-rank soldiers could be rotated backward, replaced by fresh men from the second rank, maintaining the wall's integrity through personnel replacement without ever breaking its structure. The Alemanni had no comparable rotation system. The warriors in Chenodomar's front ranks fought until they could no longer fight. Germanic noble optimates and their professional retinues drove forward on the Alemanni right center with exceptional force, breaking through the Roman first line at one point. Ammianus notes this breakthrough without editorial color. It was a serious penetration, not a minor local success. The first line had been pierced. The Alemanni warriors who poured through the gap were now inside the Roman formation, behind the front ranks, threatening to exploit the hole and drive the two Roman lines apart. What stopped them was the ground they had just covered. Breaking through the first line required maximum effort over maximum resistance. The warriors who punched through were tired in the specific way that brief, violent effort produces. The kind of exhaustion that hits immediately after the obstacle is removed, when the muscles that had been straining against resistance suddenly have nothing to push against. They advanced into the gap. The second Roman line, the Primini reserve formation, had not moved. It had been watching. And now it did something that the Alemanni breakthrough force, still processing the surprise of success, was not ready to receive. The Primini legion was the Roman army's living institutional memory. The __quote _4 in its name was not an honorary designation. It derived from the earliest of the Roman legions in the post-Constantinian reorganization, a unit whose lineage ran back through the military reforms of the preceding century to formations that had fought on the Rhine since the reign of Augustus. These were not auxiliary troops or recently incorporated Germanic federates. They were professionals whose entire existence was defined by the one thing the fulcrum required, above all else: the ability to stand and hold when standing and holding felt impossible. They had watched the cataphracts break and flee. They had watched the cavalry crash through their own right wing. They had watched the first line take the full weight of the Alemanni globus and bend. None of it had moved them from their reserve position, which was exactly what reserve formations were trained to do. Nothing, until nothing was the wrong choice. The Alemanni breakthrough force had entered the gap in the first line. The Primini received an order. Ammianus describes what followed as a tightening crescent. The reserve line did not advance straight forward into the gap, which would have created a simple head-on collision with warriors who had momentum and the psychological advantage of having just broken through enemy infantry. Instead, the Primini curved their formation outward at both ends while the center held. The shape that resulted was concave from the Alemanni perspective, a bowl closing around the warriors who had entered the gap, rather than a wall pressing against them. The implications of the crescent formation were geometrical and immediate. Warriors who had been driving forward through a gap now found themselves inside a curve that was contracting. Every step forward took them deeper into encirclement. The men on their flanks were no longer open ground. They were Roman shields, angling inward. Retreat was still possible, but it required turning around in the middle of a formation press, which is among the most difficult maneuvers an infantry soldier can execute without losing his footing and his life simultaneously. Ammianus does not record a dramatic moment of psychological collapse in the Alemanni breakthrough force. What he records is the cessation of their advance. The warriors who had punched through the first line stopped moving forward. They pressed against the crescent. The crescent held and continued to close. The breakthrough had been absorbed. On the wider front, the significance of this development took minutes to propagate through Chenodomar's formation. This is a mechanical reality of ancient battle that modern imagination tends to underestimate. In the noise and compression of 20,000 men pushing against each other across a front of several hundred meters, information traveled at the speed of a running man at best, and often did not travel at all. Warriors on the Alemanni left wing, still engaged in their own shoving contest with the Roman right, had no way of knowing that the center breakthrough had been contained. Warriors in the Alemanni rear ranks, pressing forward to add weight to the men in front of them, could not see that the men they were pushing toward had stopped. Julian, mounted, could see all of it. He had watched the cataphracts return to their positions behind the infantry. He had watched the cornuti hold on the right. He had watched the Primeni crescent close around the breakthrough force. He had watched, most importantly, the thing that Chenodomar could not see from the ground. The Alemanni front line was not fresh. It had been pressing against the Roman fulcrum in summer heat for a period that Ammianus's account suggests was measured in hours, not minutes. The globus tactic, designed for a sharp, decisive penetration, had instead become a grinding contest of endurance. And in a grinding contest of endurance between a tribal levy and a professional standing army, the Romans had one structural advantage that could not be overcome by numbers. They were doing this for wages, not glory. The moment of shift, when it came, was not announced. It was felt. Tactical momentum in ancient battle was a physical phenomenon before it was a psychological one. The first symptom was not panic. It was weight. Soldiers who had been driving forward against resistance began, fractionally and almost imperceptibly, to transfer weight to their rear foot instead of their front. The change in pressure was measurable to the men in the opposing front rank as a slight easing of the force against their shields. Fraction by fraction, the pressure that had been pressing them backward began to resolve into equilibrium, and then into something that could be pushed against. Ammianus records the counterattack without specifying a single triggering order or officer. This is characteristic of his battle reporting when describing moments of collective decision. The Roman counterattack at Argentatum was not commanded so much as it was recognized by the officers at the front as the available moment and exploited. The front lines leaned forward. The men behind them followed. The Alemanni front line, which had been pressing forward against resistance, found the resistance unexpectedly gone and stumbled into forward momentum it no longer controlled. The fulcrum transformed into pursuit with the mechanical logic of a spring releasing. Warriors who had been locked against shields at arm's length suddenly had room to use weapons at full extension. The Roman short sword, the spatha in its late Roman form, designed for close quarters thrusting, came into its intended use. The front ranks of the Alemanni, exhausted from hours of sustained pressure, were driven backward into the men behind them. What happened next has a name in military history, though the soldiers experiencing it had no name for it. The compression collapse. An army that breaks under pressure from the front does not simply stop fighting and walk away. The men in the rear ranks are still pressing forward, unaware that the front has turned. The front is now trying to move backward, but the rear is still pushing them toward the Romans. The formation that had been a weapon pointed at the Roman lines became a compression trap, its own weight preventing the individual escape that every fighter's instincts demanded. The Alemanni broke toward the Rhine. Not all at once. The collapse ran through the formation from the front, where the pressure had reversed, backward through the ranks, each tier of men reading the situation from the behavior of the tier in front of them. Where the Romans pressed, the line gave. Where the line gave, panic spread. Where panic spread, men stopped being a formation and became individuals, each running toward the river behind them, each slowing every other man's escape by occupying the same ground. The Rhine was cold, deep in late summer from the alpine glacial melt, and approximately 400 meters wide at the Strasbourg crossing. Warriors in full Germanic equipment, heavy linen or leather fighting dress, iron weapons, round shields, are not naturally buoyant. Thousands reached the banquet and went into the water regardless. Ammianus records that a significant number drowned. He does not editorialize about this. He records what the river took. The cavalry, the same cataphracts who had broken and been shamed back into position, executed the pursuit that cavalry was specifically designed for. Ammianus records that they rode and the Alemanni ran. and the killing continued until there was no one left to kill on the west bank of the Rhine. The total Alemanni casualties that Ammianus documents: 6,000 warriors killed, Roman dead, 243 soldiers. He names some of the Roman officers among the fallen, the precision of a man who checked records. For the Alemanni figure, he provides an estimate, not a list. 6,000 is the best available count. Even Zosimus, who is prone to dramatic exaggeration and whose later figure of 60,000 dead historians universally reject, agrees that the Roman casualties were remarkably low. The ratio speaks in any language. 25 to 35,000 went in. 6,000 came out dead. The rest escaped across the Rhine or surrendered at the river. The sun was still up when it ended. August afternoons on the Rhine plain are long. Chnodomar did not drown. The escape boat was there as he had arranged it, waiting at the bank. He reached it. He got in. He was captured before it could take him across. Ammianus's account of the capture is as brief and without apparent satisfaction. A professional soldier recording a professional outcome. The great king of the Alemanni, undefeated for years, still wearing the gold-leafed helmet that had marked him above the press of 30,000 warriors that morning, was taken at the riverbank by Roman soldiers and brought before the Caesar who had destroyed his army. What followed is the scene the entire script has been building toward. And Ammianus documents it with the care of a man who understood he was recording something worth preserving. Chnodomar, according to Ammianus, fell before Julian in abject terror, not the calculated submission of a king accepting capture according to warrior conventions, but what reads in the Latin as genuine physical prostration, the full-body acknowledgement of a man who had lost everything and knew it. He shook, he groveled. Julian's response is among the best documented moments of his character in the historical record, and it is entirely consistent with everything Ammianus tells us about how he governed. The young Caesar, 25 years old, who had arrived in Gaul with 360 men and an academic education, who had survived siege by his own side's general refusing to relieve him, who had just watched his cavalry break and reconstituted them by force of personal presence, looked at the most feared Germanic warlord of the Rhine frontier prostrating himself in the dirt, and said, according to Ammianus's direct account, that the king's safety was sacred to the honor of Rome. Not a threat, not a speech about Roman power or divine favor or the glory of the empire. A statement of principle addressed to a man who expected death and received instead the assurance that Rome kept its word even to its enemies. Chnodomar was bound not as a trophy, but as a prisoner of war. The technical distinction that determined how he would be treated going forward. Julian's soldiers had watched all of it. The cataphracts who had fled the field, the cornuti who had held when the cavalry crashed through them, the praemoni who had closed the crescent, the front-line veterans who had pushed for hours in August heat. They processed the battle's result and arrived at a collective judgment that ancient armies had the right and custom to express. The acclamation rose from the formation. Augustus, Emperor, the highest title in the Roman hierarchy. Not Caesar, the lesser rank Constantius had granted Julian. But Augustus, the equal of Constantius himself. Julian refused. The refusal was not theatrical modesty. It was calculation accurate enough to determine his survival. Constantius II had a documented history of interpreting the success of his subordinates as a threat requiring elimination. His own Caesar Gallus had been executed 3 years earlier for accumulating too much independent authority. A Caesar who allowed his soldiers to proclaim him Augustus after winning the empire's greatest recent military victory without the senior emperor's sanction. would be read in Constantinople as a man preparing a coup. Julian understood this with the clarity of a man who had watched his entire family die of Constantius's suspicions. He thanked his soldiers. He declined the title. He ordered the army to make camp and attend to its wounded. Chnodomar was sent east, eventually reaching Constantius's court in the Eastern Empire. He died there, in Rome, in peaceful custody. A king who had terrorized the Rhine frontier for a decade, ending his days as a curiosity in someone else's capital. The gold-leafed helmet's final location is unrecorded. Julian had 12 hours before night fell over the Argentatum plain and a Rhine covered in floating debris. He used none of them to celebrate. The immediate post-battle work of an ancient army was grinding and specific. Wounded to be treated, dead to be identified and recorded, prisoners to be secured, stragglers to be prevented from looting the Roman dead. Ammianus records Julian moving through these tasks, with the attention to logistical detail that had already distinguished his command in Gaul. The same methodical discipline that had characterized the winter reorganization of border garrisons, after the same refusal to allow victory to become administrative disorder. 243 Roman dead were recovered and buried with military honors. The surviving Alemanni nobility, who had not drowned or escaped, were sorted by rank. Their names and tribal affiliations recorded for intelligence use. Captured kings who had fought under Chnodomar's confederation provided information about the internal structure of the Alemanni political hierarchy. Information that would shape Julian's Rhine strategy for the next 3 years. The campaign that followed the battle is sometimes described as a mop-up, which understates its deliberate purpose. What Julian conducted in the weeks and months after Argentatum was the systematic expulsion of Alemanni settlers from Roman provincial territory, families who had occupied Alsatian land since the Civil War years, entire communities who had established themselves on the West Bank during the decade of the border's absence. Julian's orders were specific. They were to leave. The legal basis was straightforward. The Rhine was the Roman provincial boundary, and everything west of it was Roman territory, regardless of how long anyone had been living on it. The operation was conducted by military units moving through villages and farms. It was displacement at scale, organized and enforced by the same army that had killed 6,000 men that afternoon. The deliberate decision not to cross the Rhine in immediate pursuit deserves examination, because it was precisely the kind of restraint that distinguished Julian's strategic thinking from the aggressive overreach that had characterized Rome's Germanic campaigns in earlier generations. He had just destroyed the most powerful Alemanni force ever assembled. The Confederation's constituent tribes were scattered and leaderless. A Rhine crossing in the immediate aftermath would have carried his army deep into Germanic territory at a moment when no Roman commander had better odds of holding what he took. He chose not to cross. His objective was the restoration of the Roman provincial border. The border was the Rhine. The Rhine had been restored. Crossing it would transform a defensive success into an offensive campaign he was not resourced to win. Instead, he sent military engineers to the Rhine and began counting what needed to be built. Ammianus documents the scope of the engineering work initiated in the aftermath of Argentatum. The fort at Saverne rebuilt and garrisoned, the granary network for the Upper Rhine resupplied, the roads, bridges, and watchtowers that professional armies required to hold territory without fighting for it repeatedly. Julian was not simply winning battles. He was building the physical apparatus of a functioning border. Roman practice following the defeat of a major enemy force included the distribution of captured populations as agricultural labor throughout the depopulated provincial territory. The years of Alemanni raiding and civilian abduction had left Gallic farmland chronically short of hands. Secondary sources indicate that captured Alemanni were distributed accordingly, replenishing the agricultural labor that a decade of raids had stripped from the province. The precise numbers are uncertain, and the mechanism was not humanitarian. It was the standard Roman military economic practice of converting military victory into agricultural productivity. What the provincial population received, alongside the resettled land and the rebuilt forts, was something less tangible and perhaps more important: the information that the Rhine was held again, that a Roman force had stood between them and the annual raiding season, that the Caesar in the field was a man who had done what the previous 2 decades of commanders had failed to do. The 3 campaigning seasons that followed Argentatum were not romantic history. They were engineering and logistics and the patient work of rebuilding a military infrastructure that had been neglected, stripped, and destroyed across 20 years of civil war and Alemanni occupation. Julian's operations between 357 and 360 were less dramatically legible than the single afternoon at Strasbourg. But they were, in the assessment of military historians who have studied the Rhine frontier's recovery, arguably more important to its long-term stability. The basic shape of those years. In 358, Julian crossed the Rhine for the first time, not in conquest, but in 3 carefully staged punitive incursions into Alemanni territory, burning grain supplies and winter stores, demonstrating that the Roman military's new capacity to project force across the river was real and repeatable. The raids did not aim at permanent occupation. They aimed at establishing deterrence, the credible promise that raiding the Roman West Bank now carried consequences that extended to the Germanic East Bank. The Alemanni kingdoms that had participated in the Argentatum Confederation, scattered and exhausted, signed treaties accepting Roman terms. In 359, Julian dealt with the Salian Franks, a Germanic confederation on the lower Rhine who had taken advantage of the years of Roman weakness to settle in what is now roughly Belgium. The operation was handled with characteristic tactical indirection. Winter marching on supply lines. The Franks had no reason to expect were operable, achieving surprise in circumstances where surprise is normally impossible, and resolving the situation through negotiated settlement rather than pitched battle. The Salians accepted Roman federate status, warriors who would eventually fight for Rome rather than against it, a pattern Julian apparently recognized as more sustainable than perpetual military pressure. The fiscal dimension of these years is documented by Julian's own writings and confirmed in secondary scholarship. When he had arrived in Gaul in 355, the Praetorian prefect Florentius was demanding a tax increase from the already depleted provincial population to fund military operations. Julian refused the increase, audited the existing tax rolls, and eliminated the corrupt surcharges that had been systematically adding to the official levy at every administrative level. The result, according to analyses drawing on Julian's own administrative correspondence, was that he reduced the effective tax burden on Gallic peasant farmers by approximately 2/3, not through generosity, but through eliminating the unofficial extraction that had been draining Gallic agriculture for years. The restored frontier did not merely protect Gaul from raiding. It created the conditions under which the province could feed itself again. By 360, Ammianus records that Julian had restored enough Rhine frontier security to second approximately 3,000 troops to Britain to assist with Pictish raiding pressure in the north, a deployment that would have been operationally impossible 3 years earlier, when every available Roman soldier in Gaul was needed on the Rhine. The frontier was not merely holding, it was generating surplus military capacity. Constantius, watching from his court in Antioch, had been receiving these reports with a mixture of gratitude and something less comfortable. The Caesar he had dispatched to fail was not failing. The province he had written off as unrecoverable was recovering. The man he had sent as a figurehead was making decisions, winning battles, rebuilding institutions, and accumulating precisely the kind of military reputation that made subordinate commanders dangerous. The empire's population in the west was beginning to tell a story about Julian that the emperor in the east preferred not to hear. In the winter of 359 to 360, Constantius resolved his discomfort with an order. The order arrived in Paris, Lutetia, Julian's winter quarters, in the early months of 360, and it carried the specific character of a demand designed to be unacceptable. Constantius required Julian to transfer the majority of his Gallic troops to the eastern frontier for the Persian campaign. The units named in the order were not random. They were the same Auxilia Palatina and legionary formations whose loyalty to Julian had been built through the campaigns of the preceding 4 years. The Cornuti, the Bracciati, the veterans of Argentatum, the men who had shouted Augustus on the evening of the battle and been declined. Constantius was not simply requesting military reinforcements. He was dismantling Julian's command by moving the men who made it function. The troops refused to go. Ammianus records the sequence carefully. The orders were announced, the affected regiments declined to comply, and the refusal escalated into a formal assembly at Paris, where the soldiers made the acclamation that Julian had declined at Argentatum. They proclaimed him Augustus again. This time, the circumstances were different. At Argentatum, refusing the acclamation had been a tactical choice. Julian had just won a major victory. Constantius was still the legitimate senior emperor, and accepting the title would have been easily characterized as opportunistic ambition. In the Paris winter of 360, accepting it was the only alternative to being stripped of his command, transported to the east, and almost certainly eliminated. The soldiers who proclaimed him were not going to Persia, regardless of what Julian decided. The question was whether they would march east under his leadership or fragment into the kind of mutinous disorder that ended provinces. Julian accepted. He sent Constantius a carefully constructed letter explaining his position. Preserved in fragments, analyzed by historians as a masterwork of political rhetoric, addressed to a man who was not going to be persuaded by it, but whose historical record of the exchange needed to reflect a good faith attempt at negotiation. He marched east with his army. Constantius marched west to meet him. They never engaged. On November 3rd, 361, Constantius died of fever near Tarsus, in what is now southern Turkey, while moving his forces toward the confrontation. He had no surviving legitimate heirs. The civil war that should have followed Julian's acceptance of the Augustus title evaporated with his opponent's death. On December 11th, 361, 4 years, 4 months, and 5 days after the battle at Argentatum, Flavius Claudius Julianus became sole emperor of the Roman world. Constantius's plan, in whatever form it had taken, was complete. The man dispatched to fail had become emperor. He ruled for 18 months. Julian spent the majority of his reign attempting to reverse the Christianization of the empire, closing church properties, restoring pagan temples, withdrawing the financial privileges that Constantine's successors had extended to the Christian clergy. He moved with the thoroughness of a convert, which was what he was. A man who had grown up performing Christianity for an audience that would kill him if he stopped, and who experienced the freedom of the imperial throne partly as the freedom to stop. Christian sources called him the apostate. He called himself the restorer. On June 26th, 363, during a campaign against Persia that most of his generals had advised him not to undertake. Julian was struck by a spear. He died that night, 31 years old. The sources disagree on whether the spear came from a Persian warrior or from someone in his own army. The question has never been definitively resolved. And it is precisely the kind of unresolved question that history tends to leave around men who accumulate enemies on multiple sides simultaneously. The last pagan emperor of Rome was dead 6 years after Argentatum. The frontier he had rebuilt would hold, in its essential form, for approximately 50 years. The men who had stood in the Fulcrum at Strasbourg, the soldiers of the Cornuti and Bracciati and Primini, would live to see a different emperor and a different Western Empire. A few of the oldest may have lived to see the Western Empire begin to unravel at its edges. But they would also have known, for the rest of their lives, that they had been there. Walk along the Rhine in Strasbourg today, and you are standing in the European Parliament's legislative district. The building that now houses the Parliament of 27 nations, the largest democratic institution in the world by number of represented citizens, sits approximately 2 kilometers from the ground, where a 25-year-old man, shaped by exile and philosophy, reorganized a collapsing battle and watched an undefeated king decide to make himself tactically blind. Military. Historians have returned to Argentatum repeatedly, not for the drama of the outcome, but for what the battle demonstrates about the relationship between institutional quality and numerical disadvantage. The ratio that dominates popular memory, 13,000 against 35,000, or even against the modern revisionist estimate of 25,000, is important but secondary. What the engagement demonstrates more precisely is the inverse. That numerical advantage, without the institutional discipline to convert it into battlefield coordination, becomes a logistical problem rather than a military asset. 30,000 men who cannot rotate exhausted front-rank fighters, cannot receive information from their flanks faster than a runner, and cannot change formation in response to a crisis they cannot see from the ground. Those 30,000 men are not 3 times the army of their opponent. They are, in the specific circumstances Argentatum created, potentially weaker. Chnadamar's numerical advantage evaporated not because of individual courage on the Roman side, though the evidence for that courage is considerable, but because the institutional machinery of a professional army is designed precisely to extract maximum efficiency from each individual soldier over extended engagements. Ammianus's account has been analyzed by military historians, including T.S. Burns and Michael Whitby, not simply as a testament to Julian's talent, but as evidence that the 4th century Roman military was far more capable than its reputation in popular history suggests. The narrative of Roman military decline in the late Empire tends to focus on 3rd century collapse, the increasing reliance on Germanic federates, and the eventual inability to field effective armies against migration-era forces. Argentatum complicates that narrative. The army that fought at Strasbourg was a late Roman force with all its supposed weaknesses, mixed origins, Germanic federates integrated at high levels, a commander with no prior military experience. It functioned. It held under pressure that broke its cavalry. It adapted to crisis. It won decisively. The question of command quality applies across both armies. Julian's contributions to the Roman victory are well documented. The decision to engage rather than withdraw, the personal intervention with the fleeing cataphracts, the maintenance of the Primani in reserve until precisely the right moment, the speed of information processing that came from remaining mounted throughout the engagement. What is less commonly examined is how much Chanadomar's dismounting contributed to the Roman victory. Historians, including Adam Howe, have argued that Chanadomar's loss of elevated perspective and lateral mobility was as decisive as any Roman tactical decision of the afternoon. The battle may have been won as much by what the Alemanni king could no longer see as by what Julian could. The Alemanni Confederation survived Argentatum. Chanadomar died in Roman custody, but his confederation did not die with him. The wars on the Rhine frontier continued, raiding, treaties, federates, the slow renegotiation of who controlled the western bank of the river. Julian's Rhine settlement lasted approximately 50 years before Alemanni pressure, combined with migration from further east, made the frontier untenable in its classical form. The Rhine was never as clean a border again as it briefly was in the years between 357 and 400. What endured longer than the frontier was what the battle demonstrated about what Rome could still be when led correctly. Ammianus, who served in the late Roman army and wrote his history partly as a corrective to the self-pity of an empire that had forgotten its own capacity, chose Argentatum as one of his set-piece battle narratives for exactly this reason. He was not writing about the past. He was writing about what was possible. The plain where it happened is agricultural land now, as it was then. Wheat in summer. The Rhine in its controlled modern channels a few kilometers east. Strasbourg's spires visible from the right elevation. The ground has been silent for 16 centuries. The line was held. The king who had never lost a battle groveled in the dirt before a 25-year-old who had been reading Plato in Athens 24 months earlier. History is not supposed to work this way. That is precisely why it does. Let the numbers settle for a moment. Contemporary records document the result at Argentatum. 243 Romans killed, 6,000 Alemanni dead, and thousands more drowned in the Rhine, and the paramount king of the Confederation in Roman custody. An army of somewhere between 13,000 and 15,000 professional soldiers, having had their cavalry routed and driven from the field within the battle's first hour, having marched 21 miles in August heat before the engagement began, had decisively defeated a force 2 to 3 times their size. Not a near thing, not a narrow escape. A decisive, documented victory whose casualty ratio has few comparisons in the history of ancient warfare. But the numbers only answer part of the question. What Julian built in the years that followed Argentatum, the restored Rhine forts, the rebuilt granary networks, the treaties with the Alemanni and the Salian Franks, the tax reform that reduced the Gallic peasant burden by 2/3 while simultaneously funding a functional military, was something more durable than a single afternoon's outcome. He took a province that Constantius's advisors had quietly written off and returned it to operational capacity. He did this in 4 years, with an original escort of 360 men, against the institutional opposition of generals appointed to oversee him and an emperor whose interests were served by his failure. None of it saved the Western Empire in the long run. The Alemanni Confederation survived and continued pressing the Rhine for another 50 years. The Western Roman state continued its gradual structural disintegration, regardless of what one exceptional commander achieved on one afternoon in Alsace. History doesn't offer those kinds of guarantees. What one man can accomplish in the time available to him is not the same as what institutions require across generations. What Ammianus understood, and what he embedded in his account of Argentatum, is that the story of Rome's decline is not a story of uniform failure. It is a story with specific exceptions, men and moments when the institutional machinery that was supposedly dying demonstrated once more that it still knew what it was for. Julian was one of those exceptions. The army that stood in the Fulcrum at Strasbourg was another. the Premiani closing their crescent around an Alemanni breakthrough force, while the cavalry was still fleeing the field. That is not the behavior of a military in decline. That is an institution behaving exactly as designed. Under circumstances, it was designed to survive. The battlefield is Strasbourg now. The European Parliament, the Council of Europe, the European Court of Human Rights, the entire apparatus of the continent's largest political experiment, operates within a few kilometers of the ground, where a professional Roman army held a line that the Western world needed held. The men who held it did not know they were holding anything beyond a single Rhine crossing on a single August afternoon. They were tired, and the cavalry had just run. And the king across the field from them had come down from his horse for reasons they could not quite understand. They held anyway. They held because that was what the formation required. History doesn't always remember the men who hold the line, but the line remembers them.